Okay, I guess I can skip my warm-up already. Okay, so we're going to cover reactive animations, and maybe most of you are wondering, like, what is that? What is reactive animations? So I'm going to cover a few of the basics, and then we are going to move into reactive ones. Before I do that, I'm going to introduce myself a little bit in more detail. But we know this now from the introduction. But I'm a Google developer expert, and this is a badge that Google gives you when you are very active in the community. And yeah, I have lots of fun, go to a lot of conferences. As you can see, I was Master of Ceremonies here. And yeah, so what else? Probably you have found some of my blogs, and this is a blog post I did on GraphQL, and I really recommend it to you. Some time for bragging. So I've been speaking for the last 2 years full time, and you can see a lot of the places that I've been. And I'm quite excited. I'm traveling to Moscow later this year, and yeah, looking forward to it. I have no knowledge of Russian, so it's going to be fun. I'm also a trainer, so you can see, maybe you can recognize someone from these people, very happy people. After the training, I'm pointing them with a shotgun. That's why they are like, wait, what are you doing? In London, I run 2 communities, and that's why I also like to participate actively. I'm not doing any talks here for local meetups, but usually I try to find a local meetup. These are both GraphQL London and Angular Zone. Angular Cruise. So this is an event that we did earlier this year, and this is the first Angular conference happening in a cruise. And you will be thinking like, what? What is that? Well, let me show you. So we have some pictures. Here we are the organizers, and some of the pictures were used in my intro. This is one of them. Really amazing cruise. Shit. Okay, we are going to do a lot of noise, okay? Just in a minute, just in a minute. And okay, that's all. That was happening in a cruise, so that's it. I'm going to talk more about this later during an interview today. I also did this Angular in flip-flops, which is a nice bootcamp that you can do. 3 days of training and then 3 days working in teams. But I'm much more excited about the next slide. So let me show you some of the pictures. Oh, you recognize that picture? I mean, once it's in internet, you know, everybody has access to it. Dangerous. Okay, so we are here. This is my 2nd year, and yesterday we had the party, and something happened. What? I mean, these are Android developers. They got really crazy with the Angular logo. What? Okay, let's move into animations. So why use animations? I mean, we are web developers, I hope, in this room. And usually we focus in a lot of different topics, but maybe animations is not on the top of them. So 2 months ago, when there was the new release from Angular Animations, I got really excited, and I started digging into it. And I find out that animations can improve a lot the experience from a website. And I found some examples that I want to share with you. One of them is the improved user experience. And you will think, okay, so do I really need this? Well, the answer is yes. You want your users to have a nice experience while using your application. And you will like to introduce some of the ideas that I am going to talk today, just to improve this experience. And you can see this example. This is built with Angular, so you will have access to the demo later today. Other things that you win by using animations is small things like perceived performance. And you have seen this probably from Facebook. They just use these placeholders, so it gives you the impression that you have some answer, like quick response. And there's more things. For example, when you get the Apple TV website, you will get the covers from the movies. You will get it in this nice immersive interaction. So actually what is happening here is the user, while he's moving the mouse around the website, the cover is responding to this movement. And it also has this like 3D effect, which is quite impressive, I would say. We also know some of the, the boring times when we are bootstrapping, for example, an Android phone, and we recognize probably this. And at these times where you cannot do much to improve the user experience, this type of animation, it gives you, more engagement with your brand, for example. And once you look at it, you could be like a lot, you just get hooked into this, like what's happening here? So it's really nice. Maybe this is like subjective, but it's user happiness. I mean, when you see some of these animations, you just feel happy. Like this is the new like button in Twitter, and I quite like it. Let's see it again. Yeah. Very good. So let's look into some of the principles behind animations. And usually, because we are developers, we don't know that much of the origins and all of the resources. So I'm going to go back a little bit so you also have this information. Everything started when there were these character movies. And this book is one of the reference books that all of the designers use. And this is called The Illusion of Life. I mean, we are not doing character animations, but we can use some of the ideas that apply to web apps. So let's see one of them. The first one, it's called squash and stretch. And there's also this concept of anticipation. And when we are dealing with animations, you need to be familiar with these concepts. You can see the example at the top is using anticipation. So it's kind of the ball, we can see the ball jumping, but it's starting with some kind of, like I'm going to jump down. And it's giving you this cue that will avoid this effect. When you're looking at an animation, it's just something changed. You don't know what happened. So the anticipation helps the user not to get surprised. The squash and stretch is more like to simulate it's a real object, so it will behave like a real object. This is another interesting principle. It's called follow through. And you can see in this animation we have this box, and it's kind of jumping, but it's not stopping. It could also jump and stop. What it's doing is kind of following with some momentum, and that's making the animation a little bit more appealing. Finally, this is probably one of the most used in animations, is exaggeration. You do exactly the same animation, but you add some more stress on the different movements. So you can see here there's some exaggeration on the weight of this box, and it just looks a little bit more comic as well. Obviously, we cannot forget the composition. This is when we are building the animations, we will take one by one the different effects, and we will make the final composition. And you can see here there's some movement at the top. There's also the fall and the rotation. And when you use all together, they create a nice appealing animation. I'm going to cover now some of the basic animation techniques. And if you don't master this, you cannot go to the next level. So this is something that you should start practicing if you want to get into animations. The first one is moving elements around the page. And you can use this transform, and just using translate will just move the element from one position to another. The animation that you can see is a little bit more complex than translate, but we're going to cover this a little bit later. The next common technique is rotating. Of course, you will compose this later on, and you can use this rotate and the turns as a measure. You can also play with the size of the elements, and in this example, I'm using a scale. And this is like a beat heard, so it's kind of beating and following this rhythm. And that's probably the most popular one, like fading in and fading out elements. You should totally get familiar with opacity. And opacity 0 is when you don't see the element. And you usually go from opacity 0 to opacity 1, which is the fully visible element. So a few things. I'm going to show you some code so you get familiar to the different techniques. Here I'm using different classes, so I can split different properties in a way that I can reuse some of them. In this base, I have the base of my animation. And this is using the CSS animation. And I'm using the keyframes definition for move, the move that I want to implement, with a duration of 2 seconds and going in a loop, which is this infinite. Then I'm using a timing function, and that's going to define the pace of the changes for this animation. So in these 2 seconds, it's going to use this function to figure it out the different values. Finally, we have the keyframes. So each of these keyframes will be applying these properties at the different times of the animation. So when it's starting, it will start with 0%, and then it will go up to 100%. So we can see that we start from the left. This is the translate minus 250. And then we are moving up to the 250 just to create the same pace of movement. Then for a moment, I'm just staying at the middle of this frame with from 40 to 60%. Let's see another example. So that was the translate. Now we're going to look into rotate. And I'm using similar concepts. So I'm just using different classes, setting up some styles, so I can use these classes later. I'm using now a spin. This keyframe is using a linear timing function. I don't want this rotation to change speed, so I'm using this linear function. And then for these keyframes, I'm using an alternative notation. So instead of using the 0% to 100%, I can use the to and from. If we are not using from, it will take the styles present on the element, so I can skip that. The next one is an example with Resize, and you can see now the different properties. And now I can also reuse some of these keyframes, and I'm doing this by using this 0%, 40%, and 100%. And that's going to be the changes that is going through over these 2 seconds. So what I was looking for in this animation is kind of a beating effect. Cool. So the last one is fading, and because fading is a little bit boring, I also add some movement. You can see how you can mix also the movement with the fading, and that's possible because we can use any number of styles in these keyframes. And these are more or less the basic techniques that you are going to use while building your own animations. So let's move into more advanced techniques. These techniques come from different sources. A lot of them are under the motion design. If you look for this topic in online, and you will find some of them in separate resources. This one is the easing. What you want to achieve with using easing is to create a natural progression of the movement. On the left side, we can see that it's using a very boring timing function, so it's the linear. And it just feels a little bit weird, mostly when it's living. On the right side, we have a nicer easing function, which is using a cubic Bezier, and it adds some rebound. So you can see there's some small rebound that's adding some more life to the animation, as we covered in the previous slides. This is also an interesting concept, and you probably recognize this technique from some of the applications you use. And this is when we have a slightly delete from some of the elements. And this will show some relationship, like parent and child relationship from these elements. This is more complex. You are binding some of the properties of one element to another element. And that's creating an interesting effect. So the movement of the bottom element is changing the size of the top element. And you can see it more and more in modern applications. This one is maybe less exciting. We are very used to it in development. And this is one of the main features in Angular, that we can bind values and we can add logic to these bindings. One other thing that we can use is overlay. So we can hide some elements behind some other elements, and depending on the interaction, then we can discover new features. So as you can see, we have different tools that we can apply. When it shines, all of these techniques is when we can see an example that it's working all together. So we can see here how we use the easing, how we use the binding between the value on the slider and also the visual representation of these different houses. And this is actually implemented with CSS. It's not using the help of any framework. You can follow the link. If you access the slides, I'm going to share them later. You can see the example built with plain CSS, which is quite amazing. Before I go into reactive animations, I want to introduce some of the basics in Angular. Angular uses states and transitions, and we style the transitions. That will make implementing the animations a little bit easier than when we use CSS, as we saw in the previous examples. We can create these transitions and then style them as we plan to run our animation. So that's how in Angular it's working. There are a few special states that we can use. In Angular, because we render the elements, some of the elements may not be rendered yet. And that will be selected or matching this void state. These elements are still not in the view. This other state is covering any number of states, so you can use it while refactoring. And we have different options. So we have the different directions. So when we are going from the void state to the asterisk state, we can also use enter to replace that transition. We can also use the opposite transition, which is the leaf. And we can also style both of them at the same time. So we have many options that we can use in Angular. Let's imagine we want to do the fade in, fade out animation, which is quite simple. What we will do in Angular is we will create these two states, and we will use the opacity 1 and opacity 0, and we will just implement this, we will style these different transitions. So we are going to change from fade in to fade out, and from fade out to fade in, and then change the styles accordingly. We can also decide to do the same animation, run the same animation for both, but just it depends what are we looking for. Let's see some code. So when we are using animations, we are using this binding with this add, and I'm calling this animation fade. And the value that we can see on the right, just after the button binding, is this fade property. The fade property is defined in the class that we can see here, and that's going to change the state that the Angular animation is running in. That will decide the styles that are going to be used. In this exact demo, what I'm doing is when every time I click in this button, it will just change the state and trigger the animation. Let's see the definition for this animation. We just have these two states. The fade in, I'm going to style it with opacity 1. That will show the element. The fade out is going to be not 0, because if it's 0, you won't be able to click on the button. You won't see the button. And then I'm going to style the transition, and I'm going to define how long it will take and what timing function I'm going to use. So that's how it's translated now in Angular. As you can see, it's more declarative. When we were using CSS, we had this mix between state and the styling. Over here, I just need to define the different states and then what is the change from one to the other, which makes defining animations much easier. We can also introduce unit tests. Because we are using Angular, we can also build on top of the animations we have with different unit tests, which is really powerful. Just in version 4.3, we got a new release of features. And some of them are covering common scenarios, like executing different parts of the animations in sequence or in parallel, that we will use accordingly, depending what we are looking for. But that's something that we don't need to use. In CSS, you would use the delay just to do the orchestration between different animations. In Angular, you can code this with these APIs, and it's just much easier to understand. We can also use composition by calling animate child. And animate child will pick any of the components of the child components and run any animations that they have defined. So the actual parent don't know what is going to happen, but it's going to wait until it's finished. So it makes composition really easy. That will work using the previous example. We can use the sequence and the group animations together, and we don't need to introduce any manual calculation on the different delays, which is the common practice in CSS. There's also this concept of a stagger, and that's, imagine we have these 3 elements animating at the same time. When you see at this animation, it looks a little bit mechanic. What you can do to introduce a little bit more appealing effect is delaying slightly one animation from the other, and you can see this, it creates this curtain effect. So different elements move slightly in a different speed. We can use that in Angular today. There's also this new feature, is the API for query. We can query the different elements that we have in our view, and we can use this, for example, for lists. So we can find the elements that were added or removed, and then apply different styles accordingly. So if we have this class with a container and then different items, I can use the CSS Selector and say, okay, pick me the elements using this item class. So we will pick these 2 child elements. I can also do some interesting things, like use this enter keyword just to find out which elements were added to the array of this list. So I can animate these in a different way. Let's see a quick demo. Okay, so this is one of the first demos that I shown at the beginning. And as you see, as it shows the elements, it's just using a stagger to show them a little bit delayed. If I'm interacting with this application, it will just use all of the principles that we saw before, creating this nice user experience. If I go and remove the animations, which is quite easy, I'm going to remove the animations very quickly, and we are going to see the difference. So now it's going to be the same application without animations. You see, just on the first render, there's no nice stagger animation. They just show in one go. When I remove the elements, this is more clunky. It feels more mechanic. You also, when I remove this element by clicking on it, you don't know what element was removed. You don't know if it's the first one. You don't know if it's the second one. So you can see how the experience changes of a simple list animation. The next area is the reactive animations, and these are specific animations that react to user interactions. This can be mapped to any of the CSS properties that we have available, and usually we can use this with different inputs. So we can use it for the mouse interaction, we can use with keyboard, a scroll, and they create these interesting effects. Some of them will be static, and some of them will be calculated in runtime. So I built some demo to show you today, and you can use any of these technologies. They are all available to you. So we have CSS, because it's the basic one. We also have Canvas, we have WebGL, and also SVG. And you can use all of these techniques with these different technologies. For Angular, if you want to create a runtime animation, you need to use what is called Animation Builder. And that's going to internally create a player that is going to run these different animations during runtime. And it's quite an interesting option that we didn't have before. And obviously you don't have in CSS. In CSS you have specified your animations, and they are statically there from the beginning. You cannot add dynamic animations unless you code some JavaScript. We are going to use for events, we are going to use React.js, and that will make the job a little bit easier. So let's see the demo first. Okay. So for this demo, I'm going to use these principles of reactive animations. And what I'm going to use is this, like, the follow. It's going to follow me. It's a little bit freaking. Like, okay, let me alone. No. And then when it catches me, it's just like surrounding me. You can use this with images. You can use this with different effects. It's interesting what you can create by using these simple techniques. And this is using animations created in runtime. There's no way you can define these moving animations statically. And there's also this fading. If I go outside of the window, it just fades out, which is a nice effect. So let's see the code for this animation. We are using Animation Builder, as I was explaining, and we just need to use dependency injection. For this example, I'm using some initial value that it's going to put the element in the center of the screen, and I'm going to run this player that is going to create the animation and run it. But it's only one iteration. Every time that I need to run the next iteration, I need to create another animation. And that's happening here. So I'm creating the animation at the bottom, and I'm using a helper function just to create the styles. And I'm using 1 second transition with the transform that we saw before, and we can use the translate with X and Y axis. So we can just make one instruction. So that's using this animation builder. What we are using for tracking the different positions from the mouse is React.js. So I'm finding out the middle of the element, and I'm using the native element offset width and offset height. And once I have the center of the element, I can start playing with it. So the next thing is I'm going to use ng on init, and I'm using observable from event, so I can gather the information from the mouse move. And just by using map, I can create the shape of the object that I want to use from my events. And I only need the X and the Y. I'm using page X and page Y because it's giving me the absolute positioning in the screen, regardless scrolling. So that's the ones that you want to use for this example. And then I need to subscribe to this observable so I can then find the last position. And then I'm going to calculate the difference between the last position and the new one, so I can animate between these two. And this is happening in runtime, so it's really cool. The only thing that is left is I need to run the player. So every time I have a new player. There's something we need to think about when we are implementing our animations, and it's performance. Some of the animations can be really demanding on the browser, and when we run these animations on mobile devices is especially important. So some considerations: avoid repaints and relayouts. To do that, we can use opacity and transform, and these are the properties that are not going to be heavy on these layout and repaints. Some trick that has been around for a long time is using the translate in the Z origin, and that will just use hardware acceleration. The problem with that is that in some devices can be really intense, so you can drain the batteries, for example. So as long as you don't abuse this, this hack, it should be okay. You can also use some classes, and I have some examples of directives that will check if the element is in the viewport, and it will add the visible class. When we have this class, we can tell the browser that this is going to be a property that is going to be changing a lot, and the browser can apply optimizations. This is the will change. And it will be used in something in this way. So the animation will only run when it's in the viewport, but also we're using the will change to tell the browser that we are going to use a transform property to do a lot of changes. So the browser can prepare for that. If you want to know more, I have some people to inspire you, and that I've used some of their examples. These are people that publish different examples on animations that are really interesting. And that was all. So I hope you enjoyed the talk. Thank you. Oh, shit.